Hello, Ambassadors. When I wrote our series of lessons from the prophets called And Justice for All, I intentionally did not prepare a lesson for Easter Sunday since we would not be meeting that day anyway. However, with this pandemic upon us and the fact that we cannot meet together for who knows how long, I thought it might be appropriate to prepare a standalone lesson for you to look at on Easter weekend. It's not a normal Easter lesson, but I think Easter is a timely occasion for this particular study. Today we're going to look at the Book of Ruth. I'd like to ask you to pause this recording right now and read the Book of Ruth before continuing. It's a very short book of only 4 chapters, but it's pivotal to the story of the Bible. So if you don't mind, stop at this point and just read the book. This small book is the 8th book in the Old Testament, and that is significant because 8 had a special significance among numbers in the Bible. 8 was the number of a new beginning. How appropriate to think of new beginnings on Easter Sunday. The book begins with the story of a family. You can read the story as it starts out in Ruth 1:1-5. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they'd lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Did you notice that the book begins by saying it took place in the days when the judges ruled and there was a famine in the land? The events in Ruth take place during the days of the judges, which were a dark period of time in Israelite history. But what a difference between these 2 books. If you remember the story of the book of Judges, the people of Israel went through a period of cycles. They would fall away from God, they'd lapse into idolatry, God would allow a neighboring enemy to attack them and overcome them, they'd be oppressed and enslaved, they'd cry out to the Lord, God would raise up a deliverer, the deliverer would fight and overcome the enemy and deliver Israel. Then Israel would spend a little time at peace before they would once again forget about God and repeat the cycle. There were about 15 socio-political cycles that took place in Israel over the period of Judges, which was about 300 years. Well, during that period of time, the events of Ruth take place. But instead of the violence and lawlessness that you see in the book of Judges, what we see in Ruth is tenderness, love, and sacrifice. It's really good to know that there are still good people even in bad days, and that God is at work in the corners of the land even though violence may fill the news. Ruth and Esther have the distinction of being the only Old Testament books named after women. And the women seem to be quite opposite, and yet they were both used mightily by God. Ruth was a Gentile who married a Jew. Esther was a Jew who married a Gentile, but God used both of them to save the nation. Ruth, if you find in the Bible, is placed right between the book of Judges and the book of 1 Samuel, and it's there for a good reason. The book of Judges shows the decline of the Jewish nation. The book of Samuel shows how God began to set up the Jewish kingdom, and right between the 2 of those, Ruth pictures Christ and his bride. The book is a kind of bridge showing that God is at work even in the darkest times, and that's a message that we especially need today. The story of Ruth begins with a tale of sorrow in Ruth chapter 1. And as often is the case, the sorrow comes from making a wrong decision. It begins with a famine in Bethlehem. That's interesting because the name Bethlehem means house of bread, and the problem is there's no bread in the house of bread. Some people assume it was because of a drought like we periodically experience in California. Others think, and I personally believe, that it may have been due to the oppression by one of the foreign powers who were periodically subjugating the Israelites during that long, dark period of the Judges. But in either case, the writer assumes that God was in control. So we have to assume that in some way, the famine was a part of God's judgment on the Israelites because of their faithlessness. Maybe we need to take a good look at our society and ask whether the terrible times that we experience are evidences of God's judgment on our godless society. A man named Elimelech takes his family and leaves the area. Now that's interesting. Elimelech's name means God is my king, but he doesn't act like he believes God is really able to rescue him. He takes his wife, Naomi. Her name means pleasantness. Keep that in mind for later. And they take their 2 sons and they go east across the Jordan and south to the land of Moab. A lot of times people in bad states make bad decisions. Abraham faced a famine one time and made a similar mistake when he went to Egypt in Genesis chapter 12. The reality is that it's better to starve and stay in the will of God than it is to eat the enemy's bread. Well, what Elimelech and Naomi plan to do is live for a while in Moab. But instead they end up putting down roots, and they live there until Elimelech dies and then the 2 sons die. The names of the sons may reflect how sorrowful their lives were. The name Mahlon means sickly, and the name Chilion means destruction. You see, the family's problem was they were only thinking about their immediate needs, their comfort, not about the God who was supposed to be Elimelech's king. And as Paul said centuries later, the mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. You see, Jews were not to mix with the Moabites. Deuteronomy 23:3 laid that down. No Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation. So when Elimelech and Naomi decided to leave Judah and go to Moab, their wrong decision brought them under God's discipline because they were outside of God's will. Well, both Mahlon and Chilion married Moabite women. Their marriages lasted for 10 years, but they had no children. As God had withheld his help during the famine, he withheld fertility to Elimelech's family in Moab. So that wrong decision to go to Moab in the first place resulted in Naomi taking a wrong direction later on. She was faced with an issue of survival. Here she is, an old woman. She has no husband, no son, no grandchildren to care for her. She lives in a foreign land with no support structure. Because of her age and poverty, she is effectively cut off from the only options that would normally be open to a widow. She can't return to the house of her father because her parents are most likely already dead. She can't enter into a Levirate marriage that would have been allowed under Deuteronomy 25 because she's past childbearing years and therefore not subject to Levirate marriage. She can't support herself through some kind of craft or trade because she doesn't have one. In fact, the vast majority of women in antiquity didn't have that kind of an option. So here's faithless Naomi. She wants to return home, but she's not wise enough to invite her daughters-in-law to accompany her. Imagine Naomi sending her daughters-in-law back to their heathen idols. She thought that, like her, their only interests were fleshly. But Ruth had higher desires than bread and marriage. Orpah returned to the old life, but Ruth clung to her. So we read the exchange between Naomi and Ruth in 1 verses 15 and 16. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God." Unlike Orpah, and unlike Naomi's advice, Ruth wanted to follow the true God, Yahweh, and give up her old heathen life. "Your God will be my God," was her steadfast decision in spite of Naomi's unspiritual direction. Well, oftentimes bad decisions and bad directions lead to bad attitudes, and so Naomi develops a bad disposition. When they get back home, a lot of changes have taken place in Naomi, and we can detect that she has a bitter spirit against the Lord. She's tending to blame God for her sorrows instead of herself. In Ruth 1 verse 20, Naomi says, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter." Look at the difference between her names. Her name is Naomi, which means pleasantness, but she wants to be called Mara, which means bitterness. Now we're going to see God using Ruth to change her mother-in-law's attitudes toward life and toward God. But Naomi had gotten herself into this situation. Chapter 2 tells us about how Ruth set about to take care of herself and her mother-in-law. Barley harvest took place in April, and so Ruth decided to enter into the harvest as a poor gleaner. The books of Deuteronomy and Leviticus laid down laws that said that Jewish farmers were prohibited from harvesting over their fields twice. Whatever they didn't collect the first time through, they weren't allowed to go back and get. That was left behind for the poor and needy. Deuteronomy 24:19 says, "When you're harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands." So, Ruth 2 verse 2. Ruth says to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Notice her determination. Let me go into the field. Let me glean and gather. Let me find favor. Ruth is all about taking care of business. So God leads her in her choice of fields so that she comes face to face with the one man God had chosen to redeem her and marry her. Have you ever noticed that God doesn't bless and guide lazy people? It's the people who are busy doing the work that needs to be done who find his direction. And so she meets Boaz. Boaz protects her and provides for her long before he marries her. Boaz in the Book of Ruth is a perfect picture of our Lord. And all of this comes from God's kindness. Notice Ruth 2:20, verse 19 beginning. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He, that is God, has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He's one of our guardian redeemers." Notice that word kindness in verse 20. The Hebrew word is hesed. It's the word that's used to describe undeserved kindness, what we would call mercy. A great description of that word is the love that will not let you go. Naomi's beginning to see the hand of God. She's seeing evidence of God's hesed, and as she does, she begins to lose her bitterness. It's a good thing to see that she's beginning to lose her bitterness. And God is going to use this Gentile woman, Ruth, to restore her blessing again. Chapter 3 tells about Ruth's surrender. Back in Moab, Naomi had told Ruth that she would find rest among her own people and among her own gods. But now Ruth and Naomi come to realize that there's only rest among the people of God and in the will of God. The time has come for Ruth to present her claims to Boaz and to give him an opportunity to be her kinsman redeemer. The Old Testament law provided that a kinsman could buy back an estate which had been lost through poverty, or could redeem a person who had been sold into slavery. That kinsman was called a goel, and his job was to take care of the less fortunate people in his own family. By buying back land that had been lost through poverty, that kept the land in the possession of the right people. But of course, the kinsman had to be willing and able to redeem in order to do so. Enter Boaz. In Ruth chapter 3, verses 7 to 9, we're introduced to a rather interesting story that leaves us somewhat confused because we're not familiar with the customs. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm your servant Ruth," she said. Men often slept at the threshing floor to protect the grain. But what about this business of her saying to him in verse 9, "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer, a Goel"? What she was doing was making a legal claim on Boaz, asking him to be the kinsman redeemer, to redeem the property that had belonged to her father-in-law and her husband, and also to claim her as his wife. This was not an immoral proposition. This was long before marriage was governed by the state. Ruth was following the custom of the day and presenting her case to Boaz. If he would redeem her deceased husband's estate, that would mean that he would take her as his wife as well, because she was a part of that estate under the way the Jews thought of property at the time. Certainly it took faith and courage for her to take that kind of step. Boaz was amazed. This younger woman didn't reject him because of his age, and he promised to fulfill the duty of a kinsman the very next day. But notice he didn't send her away empty-handed. He let her leave with an awful lot of grain. We can see in Ruth's actions a beautiful illustration of the believer's relationship to Christ. Certainly, if we want fellowship with him, we have to be washed, anointed by the Holy Spirit, and clothed. But our proper place is at his feet, just like Ruth at the feet of Boaz. As it was for Ruth, for us too, it's night now, but we fellowship with him until the morning comes, and he claims his bride, the church, for himself. Chapter 4 tells about Ruth's satisfaction, how she got what she set out for. There was another man in Bethlehem who had a prior claim on the estate of Ruth's husband. So Boaz went to him the very next day to give him the priority claim to which he was entitled. The man was anxious to claim the land, but he didn't want Ruth. He says, "I can't marry her lest I mar my own inheritance." So this unnamed kinsman knew that any sons Ruth would bear to him would carry not his name, but the name of her first husband. And thus he would lose the estate that son might inherit. So as far as he could tell, it was a bad business deal from his point of view, and he certainly didn't care anything about Ruth. But Boaz was willing to pay any price to redeem the woman and her estate simply because he loved her. So, according to custom, when the one man declined to redeem the inheritance, he removed his sandal and handed it to Boaz in the presence of the witnesses. That signaled that Boaz now had the right to redeem the inheritance and to marry Ruth. How wonderful it is that Christ was willing to make us a part of his inheritance and to claim us as his bride. How unselfish was his love for us. This is a beautiful picture of Christ and his love for the church, as Jesus is our Goel, our kinsman redeemer. We now discover the significance of the book because Ruth becomes an ancestress of David. You recall that Deuteronomy 23:3 excluded a Moabite from the congregation of Israel even to the 10th generation? But the grace of God makes Ruth, the Moabite, a member of the earthly family that gave Christ to the world. When you read the genealogy of Jesus, it begins this way. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar, Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. This was not only true of Ruth, but it was also true of Rahab, of Tamar, and of Bathsheba. And each of those women played parts in sordid stories of immorality. The line of Christ included 3 immoral women, Tamar, Rahab, and Bathsheba, and it included 2 Gentiles, Rahab and Ruth. What a testimony to God's grace. So this book begins with a funeral, and it ends with a wedding. It opens with famine and closes with fullness. Ruth's love for her mother-in-law and her willingness to obey the word brought her joy and blessing. And the decision she made in Ruth 1:22 determined her future. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God. Had she gone back to her heathen way of life, we would have never heard a word about her. So what lessons can we learn from the book of Ruth? Well, we can learn about Ruth and Naomi and the way they were redeemed by Boaz, and we can see how that compares with our redemption by Jesus. You see, the book of Ruth is the story of redemption by God's He said, His love that will not let go. It has a prophetic purpose. Ruth 1 shows Israel out of the will of God and suffering His chastening. But then God begins to deal with a Gentile, Ruth. Just as today He's calling out from the Gentiles a people for His name, according to Acts 15:14. Naomi's blessing comes after Ruth's wedding. And then there is a typical analysis of this book. Because Boaz is a picture of Christ, who is our Goel, our kinsman redeemer. Christ took upon Himself our flesh, of course without sin, but He did that so that He might redeem us. He paid the price, and He did it because He loved us. Just like Boaz, He is the Lord of the harvest. He supplies our needs, He redeems the inheritance for us, and He gives us rest. But there's a practical aspect to the story too. Faithlessness is a serious matter. It cost Naomi her husband and her 2 sons. No matter how difficult the circumstances of life may be, the only place for God's people is in the will of God. When we seek satisfaction from the world, we pay a high price for that. But God is willing to forgive us and restore us to favor. Naomi could never regain the lost time out of God's will, but what she did regain was her joy and testimony. What about you? Are you living in rebellion, or has God been working on you to bring you back to faithfulness? The bottom line message of Ruth is that even in the most difficult of times, the Lord never fails. Today we see people who are sick and dying without loved ones by their sides. And we see people whose loved ones are sick and dying, but they can't be with them. We see people who have lost jobs and lost income, and people who are suffering that loss with no real help on the horizon. We see people who are homeless already and are now facing a severe illness as well. We see people who are watching their retirement investments evaporate right before their eyes. We see lonely Christians who now cannot even enjoy the hugs and handshakes of their church fellowship. And everyone else who is being affected by this COVID-19 pandemic or any other calamity that may befall now or in the future. The bottom line message of the book of Ruth is, the Lord never fails.